So today in our gospel reading, we hear this line from Jesus, "I came that they might have life and have it in abundance." Or some translations say, Jesus says, "I came that they might have life and have it to the fullest." John 10:10. One of my favorite verses in all of Scripture. But sometimes when we think about Jesus or Christianity or religion, there's this idea that all it is a bunch of oppressive rules that take away our freedom and our fun. As I like to remind our youth sometimes, when I have Mass with them, I ask them, I said, Jesus came to die, to suffer and die on the cross and rise again so that you could come and be bored in church. No, that's not the answer. That's not why he came. Just so you could come and be bored. Though that's sometimes the sentiment we have. Great, Jesus did all this so we can come and be bored. No, Jesus says, as we hear in the gospel today, "I came that they might have life and have it in abundance, fullness of life." So what is this fullness of life? You see, all the rules that we have in the church, the rules, the moral vision and teaching of the church, isn't that so we live a constricted and a lesser life, a restrictive life. It's rather so that we can be liberated to live life to the fullness. That's the moral vision. That these rules, these disciplines, virtue that Christ came to bring, so that we could be fully alive. That's the idea. It's sort of like, one analogy is like a car engine. In a car we have this, basically what a car engine is it's this literally an explosion that happens repeatedly just in front of you in the car engine. And of course, it's constrained and channeled in such a way that the force of that explosion that allows the car to function, to go forth, to be able to drive and move places. That is channeling that explosive power to propel us to places, to distances, and we can cover great distances in a small amount of time. And it's similar with our souls. See, we have this fire of desire in us, our passions within us. But the Christian moral vision isn't to repress those and say that those are bad, but rather to contain them, to channel them, to give them direction, so that we can be a driving force of good. So that we can live as we were made for. To function as we ought to. Because just think, in a car, if that explosion of the gasoline going into the engine did not have the proper constraints and boundaries, a few things would happen. Well, first of all, it would just explode. And then, secondly, your car wouldn't go anywhere. And you wouldn't go anywhere because you might be fried to a crisp. But it's channeling that force so that the car can be what it's meant to be. A car that doesn't go anywhere isn't really a car that's in the fullness of carness. And so too with ourselves. It's about channeling this desire so we can live fully as humanity through virtue, through discipline, and so forth. Or to give another analogy, the boundaries of a river, the banks of a surging river, of rapids, if you will, is only able to flow and charge because the banks of the river channel it in such a way that it gives the water direction that it can flow. But of course, what happens if you remove those boundaries, the banks of the river? Well, the waters stop flowing. It just becomes a stagnant swamp that doesn't go anywhere. It lacks the life-giving energy. And for anyone, sometimes there's this sentiment that Jesus says, Jesus doesn't really care about our morality or virtue. Well, I encourage you then, go read the Sermon on the Mount. See, Jesus didn't come to say, that doesn't matter. He actually came to up the ante. You've heard it said, don't kill anyone. But I say to you, don't even bear hatred in your heart. And so on and so forth. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say to you, don't even look lustfully and hold lust in your heart. But again, it's not because Jesus wants to constrain us, but to give us the proper direction so that we can be fully alive and fully human. And more than that, that he gives us the grace and the power to do that. And the mercy and forgiveness that can draw us back in when we fail. So secondly, to be a second point about being fully alive. The part of the fullness of life that Jesus came to bring is to bring a peace and a joy that we can live out of that's deeper than the circumstances around us. Paul talks about in his writings about rejoicing in suffering. To rejoice in suffering. Now, we may hear that and think, what, was Paul a masochist? That he just like, oh, I'm suffering, hooray. That he was delighted that he was able to suffer? No. But rather, what Paul was getting at is not that we rejoice because of our suffering, but that even in the midst of suffering, to ground our souls in such a place, that we still have that grounding of peace and joy, even in the face of great tribulation. To ground ourselves in something that's deeper than simply the circumstances around us that are constantly changing. As Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, he gives us that image of building ourselves like a house on rock as opposed to sand. So then when the storm comes, of course the house built on sand and not solid foundation, not grounded, is blown away to bits. But Jesus wants to draw us to that place of finding that deep spiritual place through his words, through the grace he came to bring us, to build our souls on solid rock so that we can weather any storm that comes. There's a man who lived in medieval Europe who caught the attention of, it seemed, the whole world because he had been the son of a rich merchant and had a good life from all worldly perspectives, but gave it all up to live as a poor beggar and to wear sackcloth. And yet, he was the most joyful person that anyone had ever met. His name was Francis of Assisi. And this St. Francis caught the attention of the world, that he gave up everything worldly, that he lived a life as a poor beggar, a life of poverty and simplicity, and proclaimed the gospel. And he was perfectly happy. He was joyful. And it was an attractive joyfulness that people would come from all over to flock to him, to say, teach us your way of life. And many people joined in following his way of life, because they just saw this joy in this simple little man. And so one day, one of the brothers asked him, they said, Brother Francis, teach us, what is perfect joy? Francis said, what is perfect joy? They said, brother, write this down. This is important. I'll tell you. If all the worldly priests and bishops that we know who are too caught up in their own gains or riches, if they turned from their worldly way of life and joined our order of poverty and simplicity and joining the gospel, that would not yet be true joy. If all the kings and queens of the world, the great princes that are caught up in their worldly affairs, turn away from their worldly desires to follow in our way of life, of poverty and following the gospel, of focusing on Christ, that would not yet be true joy. And he goes on another level. If the whole world were converted, that would not yet be true joy. If all these wondrous and amazing things happened, that would not be true joy. But what perfect joy would be is if I came back from a long journey in the middle of winter on a cold blizzardy night, that it's so cold that icicles are forming on the edge of my tunic and banging against my shins, my legs, till the point that they start bleeding and my toes are freezing, and I come back to our humble little monastery and I knock on the door and I say, please let me in, for it's freezing. And if the brother then says, Francis, we don't know any Francis. Go away from here, and slams the door in my face and spits on me. And if I'm able to have that experience and walk away and still have joy, that, my brothers, is perfect joy. Now, what is the point of Francis's story, what he told his brothers? Again, it's not to be a masochist that we delight in suffering, but it's that our joy is to be grounded in something deeper. What Francis showed with his whole life was that there is something, there is a love, there is a hope, there is a peace worth giving up everything for, that ultimately nothing in this world will satisfy our hearts. And that's where we have to ground ourselves in the one thing that will satisfy. In God Himself, in Jesus Christ, and following Him. And that's where we find that joy that stands against the force of the world. A third and final story. We also heard in our responsorial psalm today, Psalm 23, about this fullness of life. There's that phrase that even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you, Lord, are at my side. We may feel with this pandemic that we're living a bit in the valley of the shadow of death. And there's a man, Archbishop Elias Chacour, who grew up as a Christian in Palestine, a native Palestinian. And he grew up during a time when the military came in to invade. And he wrote a book about his experiences growing up as a young Christian Palestinian in a very tumultuous time in Palestine. And eventually he became a Catholic archbishop of a Melkite rite, an Eastern rite in the Catholic Church. But Elias Chacour writes about how him and his family, they were sort of walking in this valley of the shadow of death, where these military forces were coming in, and they heard of violence and towns getting destroyed, people getting killed, men, women, and children in neighboring towns around them, or at least being driven out of their town. And eventually they themselves, him and his family and the townspeople, were driven from their home that had been in their family for generations, including the fig orchard to which his father himself had planted all these figs and tended them and planned to pass that on as the inheritance to their children. All of this they were driven away from. And so they were sort of living homeless. And they were hoping they could return, but then they got the bad news that all their lands had been sold to some rich merchants. So I want to share with you Elias Chacour's words that he writes about his father. And the example of his father was when they heard that their orchard had been purchased. So when he was a child, he wrote about this childhood experience. He wrote, "Most painful was the word that Father's fig orchard had been purchased from the government by a well-to-do settler as some sort of investment. At this news, Father's face furrowed with grief. I was terrified that he would weep. He was still, his eyes shut, his mustache drooping above a faintly trembling lip. He had planted those fig trees himself, one by one, straining with heavy clay jars of water up the steep slopes, caring for each sapling until it was strong enough to survive on its own. They were almost like children to him. And in the same moment, I wished that Father would rage. Perhaps fear had numbed my anger before this time. Now as I watched Father's pain-lined face, I shook with a horrible feeling. My brothers and I squirmed. None of us could bear to see Father, dear gentle Father, in such agony of spirit. But when he spoke in a few minutes, his voice was barely above a whisper, and he said, 'Children,' he said softly, turning those sad eyes upon us, 'if someone hurts you, you can curse him, but this would be useless. Instead, you have to ask the Lord to bless the man who makes himself your enemy. And do you know what will happen? The Lord will bless you with inner peace. And perhaps your enemy will turn from his wickedness. If not, the Lord will deal with him. I could scarcely believe it. His life's works had just been torn from his hands. His land and trees, the only earthly possessions he had to pass on to his children, were sold to a stranger. And still, Father would not curse or allow himself to be angry. I puzzled at his words. Inner peace. How I marveled at how Father could find strength in such circumstances. A part of this abundance of life that Jesus invites us to, the freedom, is that we, like Elias Shakur's father, have the choice to choose not to hate, to bear resentment and unforgiveness. That ultimately we always have the choice to love. Now, forgiveness and love is not simply saying that a hurt that was done is not that big a deal, or so on and so forth. Letting the person off the hook. No. Rather, it's saying that this is a big deal, but I make the choice that the life that Jesus invites us to choose that this hurt, this evil that was thrust upon me will no longer have power over my life. It will not dominate me. This darkness will not hold power over me. The freedom of love. This is what Jesus invites us to. Because hatred and bitterness and unforgiveness can bind us. I once knew a woman who lived a very broken life, that she had been unfortunately abused by a boyfriend and then lived in a series of broken relationships. And she told me how much she had hated that man. And you could see how that hatred was literally ruining her life. That if she were but to make the choice to love, to forgive, that she could be liberated from this hurt, from this hatred over her. That when Jesus says to turn the other cheek, it's not just simply to cower in a corner, but to stand strong even in the face of injustice and evil. And to say, I will not let this dominate me. That Jesus invites us to the fullness of life, to abundance of life that comes through virtue, through moral living, through finding that place of inner peace that's deeper than any of the circumstances we've experienced, inner peace, inner joy, and to make the choice, the power, the freedom of love. So that the power of sin, of our circumstances that we can't control, and hatred and bitterness no longer dominate our life, but that we're free and liberated to live in the fullness. As Jesus says, I came that they might have life and have it in abundance. Amen.